name is Madhura Vachon, and I'm going to talk about a pilot study I did with UMASH looking at stress in Minnesota show cattle. Acute stress in cattle increases the risk of bacterial shedding into the environment. It also negatively affects cattle health, and it reduces the quality of beef and dairy products. Cattle experience psychological stress from handling, transportation, commingling or social mixing, exposure to new and unfamiliar environments, exposure to loud or unfamiliar noises, and physical restraint or stimulus. And all of these are common at agricultural fairs and other cattle shows. But existing literature evaluating cattle stress has focused more on long-haul transportation and on slaughter-specific stressors, and they haven't really quantified cortisol levels at agricultural fairs, where the environmental stimuli might be really different and the contact rate between animals and the public is high. So to address this knowledge gap, I carried out a pilot study, a prospective cohort study in Minnesota cattle to compare stress in show cattle with matched cattle at the same farm that were not being shown. Cattle owners were eligible to enroll their cattle if they were showing at a county or state fair in Minnesota in the summer of 2022. This recruitment flyer and corresponding letter were sent to the Minnesota Future Farmers of America teachers and also disseminated to the Minnesota Dairy Initiative listserv. Cattle owners who signed up for this study completed a 38-question survey, which included questions about basic farm-specific information, perceived stress, show preparation, and other information. And blood samples were collected at 3 time points from all cattle. So at time 1, samples were collected from all cattle at farm locations before the show cattle were transported to show. At time 2, they were collected from all of the cattle after the show cattle arrived at the fair. And at time 3, they were collected from all cattle on the day the show cattle returned home, but before they actually left the fair. And I had 2 distinct time points, T2 and T3, to distinguish between the stress that might occur from transportation and the stress from showing activities and fair activities. There was an average of 8.25 days between T1 and T2, and an average of 3.75 days between T2 and T3. Blood was collected into red top tubes using a tail vein collection. You can see that in the top photo. It was spun in a variable speed centrifuge on site, which you can see on the bottom photo. Tubes were labeled with the cow or calf's identifying information and transported on ice to the lab for serum testing. So my primary outcome of interest was serum cortisol level, which is a stress hormone reported out in nanograms per milliliter, which is a continuous outcome. I compared serum cortisol levels of show cattle with matched cattle from the same farm by performing a paired t-test at each time point, and all data were analyzed using R. So samples from 8 pairs of cattle were tested for this study, so 16 total cattle at 3 time points. We expected to have 48 samples, but 3 were missing for logistical reasons, so we had 45 samples for the study. All of these were owned by 4 youth cattle exhibitors from 3 farms, and the majority of cattle were dairy. All of the cattle owners perceived stress in their cattle in some way. The most commonly noted stress behaviors included vocalizing, open-mouth breathing, restlessness or agitation, and reduced feed intake. And average serum cortisol levels among all cattle was 5 nanograms per milliliter. The levels were highest at time 2, but I did not observe any significant difference in average serum cortisol levels over all cattle across all 3 time points. You can see that the matched cattle that stayed on the farm actually had consistently higher serum cortisol levels throughout the whole study period, but again, I observed no significant difference in mean serum cortisol levels between the show and matched cattle at any time point from the paired t-test. So one thing that's really interesting is that serum cortisol levels in this study were quite lower than levels measured in other stress studies. Our average was 5 nanograms per milliliter, and that's even lower than established mean basal serum cortisol concentrations in unstressed cattle from prior studies. And this could be because cattle from other studies have been sampled when exposed to harsher environments than typically associated with the cattle show, things like longer transportation routes or transportation with many other unfamiliar animals or slaughter or marketing related stressors. The second thing is that reviews have kind of overgeneralized that we know that stress from transportation will increase shedding, and we know that cattle are transported to fairs, thus stress from transportation might increase shedding at fairs, but we might be overestimating the influence of shedding specifically due to stress at shows given the minimal external stimuli and the large amount of preparatory activity that goes into caring for show animals. Certain logistical factors impacted data quality in this study. Also, initially, when I was doing power calculations, I used estimates from the literature, but given that the differences were much smaller than expected, the study was low powered. But overall trends in the data collected have a lot of value, particularly the low serum cortisol levels overall, and offer hypotheses for future testing.